Hello, my name is Sarah O'Donohue, and I will be your presenter today. I am currently a behavioral therapist assistant at a clinic located in the west suburbs area of Chicago. This spring, I will be graduating with my master's in applied behavioral analyst at Ball State University through their online graduate program. Our presentation will be about discrete trial training. So our first slide is what is discrete trial training? Well, the abbreviation for this is DTT, which stands for discrete trial training. It is used to help teach new skills to individuals diagnosed with autism. You should isolate skills and teach them in necessary small components to help client comprehend skill fully. Individuals learn said skill through repetition and prompting. Make sure you make all components as clear and concise as possible when teaching them to the client. All members of the team should be implementing intervention consistently and the same. It is everyone's responsibility to make sure everyone is on the same page about how to use DTT with client correctly. Make sure the environment is free from any distractions before implementing the intervention. And make sure you have all materials available and ready before starting each trial. So here are some tips when we use DTT. Instruction should be divided into easy steps that are detailed and concise. So make sure, again, that not only do your client understand the steps or the skill, but also everyone on the team so that everyone understands exactly what is expected of each member. You should teach each skill until it is mastered by the client before moving on to the next. So what I mean by that is when you teach each skill, you need to make sure you repeat it enough and they have enough correct responses that you know specifically the skill is mastered. The next thing would be begin with the prompting level that is needed by the client. We usually start from the least invasive to the most invasive, and whichever prompt client responds correctly to for the intervention would be the one you would use. So you usually start with the least invasive. So that would be like form of gestural response, prompting and stuff like that. And then you would go all the way to full physical prompting if the client doesn't respond to any other prompts and was able to respond correctly to what is asked of them. So you need to make sure you fade the prompt or change the prompt level once client mastered the skill. So once the client has shown progress and has mastered and done a correct response multiple times, you would be able to decrease the prompting level or fade it from the intervention, depending on what exactly level they are on in prompting. Learned skills must be reinforced with incentives that meet the client's interests. So we like to use any form of preference assessments, which help us determine exactly what the client's interests are in. Some clients like watching certain videos of iPad, or some clients are really into Barbie dolls, or some clients are into fishing, like this picture. So you would try to pick a reinforcer or incentive that you believe best would keep your client motivated to continue using and doing the intervention. So in this article written by Hillman, Lehrman, and Castle, they stated that these findings indicate that DTT was highly effective in producing rapid acquisition, maintenance, and generalization of these behavior analytical skills. So throughout their study, they discovered the effectiveness of DTT when used with autistic clients, as long as all team members used intervention correctly and effectively. Plus, it also seemed to encourage maintenance of behavior and generalization of the skill in all sorts of different types of environments. As for maintenance and generalization, once we get towards the end of this PowerPoint, we will talk more in detail about what exactly these terms mean and what they would mean for your client specifically. So our next slide is about three-term contingency. This is also known as the ABCs of behaviors. ABC stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequences. Antecedents are any events, actions, or circumstances that occur immediately before a behavior. So you would write down or observe anything that happens right before a behavior is used by the client. So for the specific situation that we will be using in this PowerPoint, our antecedent would be placing the animal cue cards in front of the client and rearranging them as best we see fit. The behavior is a response to the antecedents. So and this would be what we are expecting of them or any sort of behavior you are observing that you think is problematic. We also use this to kind of help us analyze any behaviors that we believe need to be worked on or specified through their intervention program. But for this specific PowerPoint, our behavior would be the client responding correctly to a question of pointing to a certain animal based on the cue cards placed in front of them. So C stands for consequences, and consequences are anything that immediately follows the behavior. So again, anything that happens with the behavior, whether that's the BT's response, which would be the behavioral technician, or the BCBAs, which would be the behavioral analysts that are specified for this case, or even the parents or anything, how they would respond to that certain problematic behavior. Or for this specific PowerPoint, our consequence would be if our client responds correctly and incorrectly to the question asked of them. So some steps of discrete trial training would be antecedent, prompting, response, consequences for a correct response, consequences for an incorrect response, and inter-trial intervals. And again, as we go through the PowerPoint, we are going to go through each of these steps specifically and in detail so there are no confusion about what it exactly entails for a DTT. So our first step is antecedents, and this stage sets up the response. They are any form of events, actions, or circumstances that occur that we have stated earlier. So again, for this specific example, our antecedent would be the instructor setting 3 cards in front of our client and seeing how they would respond to those said cards. So it would just be the setup, nothing else. So the prompting would be, it is usually used to help encourage clients to respond appropriately to a certain situation. For this specific PowerPoint, our example would be the instructor setting up the 3 cards in front of the client, then the instructor would say, find the dog. For our specific client, we are going to say that they are on the gesturing prompts level. So the instructor would then say, find the dog and point to the dog themselves. And we would hope then after that, that the client would point to the dog right after that. They see that gestural response. So our next stage is responses, and responses comes after both the prompting and the antecedents. So this is also called the desired behavior. DTT is used to teach clients a desired response or behavior. Example would be the client pointing to the dog when asked to find the dog by the instructor. So exactly what we said before is our goal would be in the specific prompting level is for the instructor to point to the dog right when they ask the question, and the client would then point to the dog right after that. So consequences for the correct response would be when a client engages in the correct response or desired behavior, then it would be reinforced through positive reinforcement. So some quote I have found in an article was reinforcement is a critical component of any behavioral intervention because it increases the probability of skill acquisition. And again, our goal of this program is for our client to gain a new skill and for us to be able to teach that said skill and have them use it in all sorts of types of environments, settings, or with different stimuli being used. So by using the reinforcer, you are encouraging the continuous use of the appropriate behavior. Positive reinforcement is any tangible item or positive words used to encourage continuous use of appropriate responses. An example of a positive reinforcement and correct response would be, for this specific example, would be, you found the dog fast, or that was a great job pointing to the dog. Then we would allow access to the desired reinforcement. And for this specific client, we are going to say it's the iPad for 30 seconds. It is important to have a time limit and how long a client should have access to the reinforcement. So this is something that you need to discuss with all team members and see what you think would be the appropriate time or duration that you believe the person should have access to said reinforcer without losing interest in the trial or the DTT we are doing. So consequences for incorrect responses is if the client responds incorrectly to the question, instructor then would respond, and that response would be discussed by all team members and determined before using that specific response with the client. So just make sure all you guys are on the same page of how you exactly want to respond to the client and how you want to handle this appropriately. For this specific example, we are going to use some sort of like avoiding eye contact and telling the client that that's incorrect by saying no, and then restarting the trial and increasing the prompting level. So for this specific example, we would say instructor says, find the dog. The instructor then would point to the dog. If the client points to the cow or just doesn't point to anything at all, the instructor would then say no and avoid all eye contact with the client. The instructor then would take away the cards and rearrange them in front of the client, and then the instructor would move on to the error correction procedure. Something to remember and to utilize when we're using DTT is negative reinforcement, which is removal of an access to a reinforcer. So any sort of, you wouldn't give the client the reinforcer you're using for them to continue doing this program. You would make sure they don't have access to it once doing the problematic behavior or when they don't respond correctly to a certain situation you have set up. So again, you would want to remove, it kind of involves the removing of any undesirable items and like leading to undesirable consequences for the client. This shows usually decrease in use of problematic behavior. So that's like a good thing to remember when we use negative reinforcement. Again, so for this specific situation, if the client does not answer the question correctly, the instructor would remove access to the iPad and move on to the error correction procedure, which is something we will discuss on the next slide about how we would do an error correction procedure for this specific situation. So for punishments, those are consequences that reduce the use of future inappropriate behavior. So again, like by removing access to the reinforcer, we're hoping to encourage the client to pay attention more closely to what is asked and to try to learn the skill more appropriately. So for this specific example, the client would be told no, and then when they do not point to the dog or do not point to anything at all, and they would not get any access to the iPad until after the error correction procedure, and they respond appropriately. So the next thing I want to go over is the error correction procedure, and here are some like common steps we should follow in order to make sure we are using this correctly. Again, this is something that needs to be discussed with all team members, and everyone should be on the same page of how to do an error correction procedure before doing a trial with the client. So the first thing to remember is we would be modeling or demonstrating the correct response to the certain situation we are doing, and we would increase the prompt or cue in order to encourage correct response. And we would continuously increase the prompting level until our specific client would use the correct response. And then after they use that correct response, we would repeat the original instruction, and then we would give them access to the positive reinforcement or the iPad for the specific client only if they answer incorrectly. If we see that they continuously answer incorrectly, that's a good thing to discuss with your lead BCBA on the case and determine if maybe you need to do something else in order to make sure the skill is being mastered correctly by the client. If for some reason, no matter what you do, they continuously respond incorrectly, a good thing we like to recommend at my specific clinic would to be to do like a skill that you believe your client will be able to do. So let's say they continuously don't point to the dog, no matter how many prompts I've used or how many different levels. I would then, before giving the client access to the iPad and losing their attention with the program altogether, I would ask the client to do a specific skill I believe they can do, like clap your hands. The client would then clap their hands, and then we would be able to grant them access to the iPad for 30 seconds before moving on. Again, you do not want to give the client the iPad unless they do something correctly or appropriately. If they continue to respond incorrectly, you need to avoid access to reinforcer because, again, we are trying to encourage correct responses to situations, not incorrect. So the next thing I would like to go over with you is our last stage in our steps for DTT, and that is inter-trial intervals. And this comes right after the consequence, whether the response is correct or incorrect. And these are intervals that come between trials and signify the ending of that trial. So it would be the duration of time between the onset of one trial and the onset of the next. So for this specific example, if the client engages in a correct response, the client would get access to the iPad for 30 seconds until the start of a new trial. The next thing we would have to go over is if the client responds incorrectly, the instructor would avoid eye contact with client and rearrange the cards before starting error correction procedure. And after that, we would do an error correction procedure and continue doing so until the client responds correctly and can gain access to the reinforcer, which is the iPad, for 30 seconds. Next term I'd like to go over with you guys before I leave would be maintenance, and this would be the continuous use of a learned skill over time. So in order to make sure the skill is maintained, we would have to make sure we repeat the DTT trial and do it with the client as many times as we believe necessary for the client to master skill with no prompting. And then we would move on to make sure that the skill the client has learned is generalized to different forms of stimuli or environments. So I put a specific picture of a dog for this specific slide because a good way to make sure the skill is generalized would be to change the image of the dog or to change the image altogether of all the cards in order to make sure that the client isn't thinking that only this specific dog is the correct answer. So again, the instructor would say, find the dog, and the client would point to the dog correctly with no prompting and be able to do so with multiple different images of dogs or in multiple different settings. So the last term I want to go over with you guys is generalization. And this is when an individual is able to apply something learned in any sort of specific situation and be able to apply it to other similar different situations. So the client would be able to use learned skill through DTT in all kinds of different environments and with different stimulus. Strikes and Baer recommend that researchers and practitioners should not assume that generalization will occur, and rather than training and hoping for generalization, researchers and practitioners should program those generalization from the onset. So for this example would be If the client is able to answer the question to find the dog in all kinds of different environments, whether that would be the school, the therapy room, or at home, or even outside. So we would want to make sure that our client would be able to answer that specific question in all sorts of different environments. Another thing would be if the client is able to answer the question to find the dog with different images of dogs. Again, we would make sure we'd use different images in different situations to make sure that the client understands exactly that a dog could be all different kinds of breeds or different looking, etc. Another way would be if the client is able to answer a question to find the dog when asked in different phrasing. So like, look for the dog or point to the dog. We'd want to make sure that the client is able to understand different variations of language and be able to still point to the dog, even if asked in a different way. Okay, so these are the articles. I found a lot of my information. So if you would like to do further research for yourself, I highly recommend you look at the articles, read through, mark them up, and make sure that you specifically understand all the information. My next slide is references for the images on the PowerPoint. So all these web links are where I found the images that I have included in my PowerPoint. And again, if you have any questions, this would be the time. If not, feel free to email me later at seodonoghue@bsu.edu.com. Again, all the participants, I will be emailing this specific PowerPoint to you. And also, well, again, remind you guys, if you have any questions, to feel free to email me. Anything that you think you need further clarification on or further instruction on. So hope everyone has a good afternoon, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation.